Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. I'm sure most of you have heard by now that the Terrence Crawford versus Errol Spence rematch reportedly now looks like it's not going to happen. It's claimed this is due to a quote-unquote variety of reasons, including the fact that Spence recently had cataract surgery.
I figured it wasn't going to happen.
Because you can't sell it. As strange as this might sound to many an Errol Spence Jr. fan, it would have actually been better if Terrence would have went out there and stopped him in the very first round than what we saw.
Yeah.
The sustained beating that he took on top of being stopped, on top of the referee waving it off. That fight was far too lopsided. And even if you had a rematch clause incorporated into the contract, that doesn't mean anybody's going to pay for it. That doesn't mean anybody wants to see a rematch, even if you want one. So now the question is, if Terrence isn't fighting Errol for a second time, who is he fighting? Well, Antonio Tarver feels that if a Spence rematch isn't next for Terrence, who he has to fight is Boots Ennis.
Similar problem to the Spence fight.
How's that work? Terrence never fought Ennis before. He didn't beat Ennis. How is this situation similar to the situation with Errol Spence Jr.?
The financials. Who's gonna pay for it?
At this point, you could hear Crawford's yawns from here. Simply put, he flat out isn't interested in fighting Ennis. You know the old saying, high risk, low reward. That's all it comes down to. Antonio Tarver, at least to a certain extent, understands where Crawford is coming from. However, the former champion believes the pound-for-pound star can't walk around with his chest out if he isn't willing to face Ennis next. In his opinion, that fight simply has to happen. The only reason Ennis has to take a back seat is to the rematch of Spence and Crawford. Tarver told Sean Porter on the Porter Way podcast, if the rematch doesn't happen and Crawford still campaigns as a champion, then he has to fight Ennis. But I don't think he's going to keep campaigning as a champion. I don't think he's going to keep campaigning at 147. Immediately after the Spence fight, they both said they may very well move up to 154 in their next outings.
So all that stuff you were saying about the financials.
Well, look.
Listen.
You can have your little rematch clause incorporated into the contract, and you can go as far as activating that rematch clause. But when you do, somebody has to pay for it. And it's not you. It's not Errol that's on the hook.
He's not the one that would have to come out of pocket to pay for a rematch. That money would presumably come from the PBC if they were willing to spend it. And given their current situation, I don't think they want to.
What Terrence is going to want for the fight, what Errol is going to want for the fight versus the commercial value of the show, the perceived commercial value. What does a rematch do in the American market if you decide to do it? The cost-benefit ratio.
If there even is a benefit to doing a rematch, and I don't think there would be. The first fight was so lopsided, there's almost no reason to run it back.
And if you did, that second fight ain't gonna sell more pay-per-views than the first one did. The mystique, it's all gone.
Poof.
There's no mystery now. We saw what happened. So why would you want to do it when you're gonna end up making less money than you did the first time? This market right now, the American market, is not as fertile as, say, the UK market, where you can do not just one, but two Eubank versus Smiths fights.
The pay-per-views here are 2 to 3 times more expensive than they are in the UK, which makes them tougher to sell. And how do you sell people a rematch?
Okay. There's no reason to do a rematch. He's not fighting Errol. But if he's not fighting Errol, why can't he fight Ennis? And it's a similar problem in the sense that, who's going to pay for that? Does Terrence have any other affiliation to the PBC? And what about Ennis? Does he have any affiliation to the PBC? Because somebody has to pay for this. That we're even having this conversation means we're already operating on the assumption that the PBC is involved or that they are still involved with the PBC, who would presumably pay to do the fight.
Ennis was never actually a PBC fighter.
I don't know if he is one now. His longtime manager, Cameron Duncan, passed away a few weeks ago. But before that, and before Showtime left the sport of boxing, Cameron Duncan had a deal worked out with Showtime to allow Boots to fight on their cards, but he wasn't actually a Heyman fighter. Now maybe that may have changed in the last few weeks.
But even if it did, Does Al Heyman want to pay for this? Does he want to do this fight?
It was Boxing Insider, Rick Glacier, that put it best. To those that don't understand that boxing is a business, there's no big money in a Boots Ennis fight for Terrence Crawford, where there's serious money for Crawford versus Zoo, or Conor Benn, or Canelo. Those are 3 big money fights for Crawford, all much bigger than an Ennis fight. To which a disgruntled Twitter user that goes by the name Aaron Connolly stated, Boots is a far bigger fight than a Zoo fight. Let's get real. Rick responded by saying, incorrect. Zoo is much bigger financially for Crawford than an Ennis fight. Here are just 2 reasons: international TV, streaming rights, and sponsorships. All of which I've brought up here on the channel. Tim Zoo has a country behind him. Jaron Ennis doesn't.
I don't care how much you like him, how enamored you are with him watching him pounce on overmatched opponents. The bottom line is, he ain't got no drawing power, and if he ain't got no drawing power,
then it's on Terrence Crawford's name to carry the fight. It's on Terrence Crawford to sell a fight. But does Crawford have any further ties to the PBC? And even if he does the PBC want to pay for it? Can they?
Do they even have the money to make it happen? When you end up putting Zoo versus Thurman on pay-per-view, that's gotta be out of necessity. It's gotta be out of necessity because you ain't got no budget. So what you're doing is crowd-funded boxing. You're hoping that the pay-per-view buys will cover the costs of the show.
Because the platform, the platform you're on, Amazon, they're just distributing the content. They're not paying for it themselves by giving you a budget. Otherwise,
you're wasting your time. You may as well be speaking Chinese to these bozos. All they know is they want Crawford versus Boots. But as much as you explain it to them, they don't want to understand. Boots ain't got no drawing power.
Tim Zoo does. Tim Zoo brings international TV rights and pay-per-view sponsorships to the table. Tim Zoo is by and large a bigger name in his country than Jaron Boots Ennis is in his. And those are the facts.
In a sentence, the reason I don't think we get Crawford versus Boots is because I don't think anybody wants to pay for it.
Try to do that thing, and you're on a hook for that fight. You might lose what money you put into it, whereas Crawford versus Zoo, that's a bigger fight in 2 separate markets instead of just 1.
It's a bigger fight. I don't care if you don't like it. That's reality.
The same applies to Conor Benn. Conor Benn is more known among Brits than Jaron Boots Ennis is known among Americans. If you need that explained to you, then you shouldn't even be having this conversation. You should just shut the fuck up and listen.
And I really do hope that I don't have to explain to you why Crawford versus Canelo is bigger than Crawford versus Boots.
I hope you yourself have enough reasoning skills to make those deductions yourself. The aforementioned fights with those aforementioned fighters are bigger money fights that would generate more money, thus making them more viable. Now, one among them is the Conor Benn fight. We could make the Crawford fight next. What separates a Conor Benn fight from a Boots fight? What makes one of those fights more viable? And as stated, Conor Benn is a bigger name in the UK than Jaron Ennis is in the US.
Yes.
Even if you think Jaron Ennis is a better fighter with a higher ceiling,
Yes.
even if Jaron Ennis has a belt, he is a champion. That doesn't mean he's got the same drawing power as Conor Benn.
Separate the fighter's popularity versus their ability.
Because they're not the same thing. If Terrence Crawford has nothing else going on, Benn is raising his hand, hoping and praying that they can meet in the center of the ring. No audacious trash talk will be used by the normally loquacious Benn. Instead, he has nothing but respect for Crawford and simply wants to test his skills against someone who he considers the best. We could make the Crawford fight next, Benn told DS News during a recent interview. You want to challenge yourself against the best.
I want to preface everything I'm about to say with this. A Conor Benn fight is fiscally more viable than a Boots fight because Conor Benn is more popular and has more money behind him. That being said, I don't expect this fight to happen any more than I expect the Boots fight to happen.
So wait a minute. Let's go back. Explain it to me. Why do you think that Conor Benn has more money behind him than Jaron Ennis?
Jaron Ennis' longtime manager, Cameron Duncan, who I mentioned earlier, he recently passed away. He had a deal worked out with Showtime where Jaren Ennis would box on that platform. But now that platform is no longer in boxing, and unfortunately, Cameron Duncan, he's gone. He's not with us anymore. So here and now, we don't know who Jaren Ennis is with, who's managing him, who's promoting him. Is anyone promoting him?
His situation is up in the air. There are a lot of questions that need answers, whereas with Conor, we already have those answers.
Yeah.
We know who he's with.
Yeah.
He's with Matchroom. If you wanted to do a Conor Benn versus Terence Crawford fight, you already know who would pay for it. Moreover, you already know they have the money. Matchroom has the means, the finances, the money to make such a fight happen.
At least more than Boots' people do. Whoever Boots' people are at this point, because we don't know.
Eddie Hearn said that he wanted to sign Jaren Boots Ennis. He wants to bring him over to Matchroom, but it's widely speculated that Jaren Ennis might go to the PBC. And if he does, then we're back at square one, and it's what I told you before. Is this a fight the PBC wants to pay for? Crawford versus Boots. I don't think they have the resources to do a fight like that. If you're Jaren Ennis and you're fighting somebody like Terence Crawford, naturally you're going to want to make a lot of money. And if you're Terence Crawford and you're a 3-division, 2-time undisputed champion, of course you're going to want to make a lot of money. And I don't think the PBC right now has a lot of money to burn.
For them, Crawford versus Boots as a pay-per-view would be a gamble.
And it could be a big one. Whereas a Conor Benn fight, on the Matchroom side of things, that's not as big a gamble because Terence has got a name and Conor's got a name. He's got some drawing power.
Don't forget that Eddie Hearn is in bed with the Saudis. They might take the fiscal burden for that fight off of him, pay for it themselves.
Satisfying the financial demands of both the fighters and using Matchroom's relationship with DAZN as their broadcast partner to distribute the show. In other words, it's more viable. It can be done if you want to get it done.
With Boots, it's a bit more difficult because there are still a lot of questions that need answers, and even if we get some of them, is this a fight the PBC wants to make? They want to pay for this. They want to gamble.
For me, it's neither here nor there because I think that Terence Crawford is all but done in the welterweight division anyway. I don't see a Boots fight happening or a Conor Benn fight happening because I think he's done at 147. Even if one fight is a bit more viable than the other, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to make it happen or that Conor Benn is even serious, deadly serious about fighting Terence Crawford. He could just be using his name to have articles written about him. I like Conor Benn, but I don't think he's above clout chasing. That's what most boxers do these days.
I mean, look at Ryan. First he said he was fighting Devin, then he said he was fighting Rolly, at the same time calling out Isaac Cruz. Then things fall apart with Rolly. Now he's going back to Devin.
Ryan is clout chasing, if you ask me, and I don't think Conor Benn is above doing the same thing. It's nice that you're saying you want to fight Terence Crawford. You're saying that, but do you mean it?
Be careful what you wish for.
Because you just might get it. Finally, in men's middleweight news, ahead of his upcoming fight with his mandatory challenger, Michael Zerafa, WBA champion Erislandy Lara says, "I'm the modern-day Bernard Hopkins. I can keep doing this for years, but can the PBC afford to pay for it? That's the question." Lara never had much traction in his career. He was never really a big name. He was a solid name, but not a big one. At 40 years old, Lara has no intention of retiring in the near future. "I'm looking forward to getting back in the ring and defending my title, especially on this first event with the PBC on Prime Video," said Lara. "I feel like I'm the modern-day Bernard Hopkins, and that I can keep doing this for years. I know that Zerafa has been waiting patiently for this opportunity, so he's going to be hungry on fight night, but he's going to realize that he's now on the world-class level, facing the best fighter in the division. It's an honor to be on this great card that's going to be action-packed from start to finish." Michael Zerafa, a fighter who's several years younger than Erislandy Lara, though he never had the ceiling that Lara has, never really competed at the level that Lara competes.
Erislandy Lara might beat him.
He's just as inactive. Neither Erislandy Lara or Michael Zerafa have seen action since 2022. They both sat out all of last year. Zerafa has been waiting for this title shot for a long time. He defeated previously unbeaten fighters Danilo Creati and Isaac Hardman in his last 2 fights. This is long overdue, ever since I became mandatory, said Zerafa. I'm very thankful to everyone who made this happen. Come fight night, the world will see why I deserve this opportunity, and Australia will have a new world champion.
If Michael wins, maybe he can move on to unified titles with Carlos Adames. It's not a big money fight, but it is a unification match. If Michael wins, maybe he can defend his title against his domestic rival, Tim Tszyu.
They were supposed to fight each other a ways back when the shutdown was still in full swing. Michael Zerafa withdrew from their fight. Perhaps they can pick up where they left off. If Michael Zerafa wins, maybe he can defend his title against Terence Crawford.
That's if Zerafa wins.
But if Lara wins, it is a little bit different because you're talking about a guy who's up there in age, doesn't really bring any international revenue to the table. I mean, if Lara wins, yeah, you could do a Carlos Adames unification match, assuming Carlos gets elevated to full WBC champion, and I think he's going to.
Yeah.
But there's not much money in that fight, not much profile.
A 40-year-old fighter,
Yeah.
even if he is a champion, that's got to be a burden on the PBC.
If Zerafa were to win, he goes back to Australia a hero. He brings that title back home. But if Lara wins, it's still gonna fly under the radar. It's already flying under the radar that he's WBA middleweight champion. You're not going to turn him into a draw. You're not going to turn him into a star at this point.
That's from the PBC's perspective. From Lara's perspective, you're gonna have to depend on them to schedule your next fight unless you branch out. And with only 12 to 14 fight dates to work with, after this fight, who knows when's the next time you're gonna fight?
Look at how long it took them to make this one. This wasn't even their original plan. Their original plan was to put Lara in there with Danny Garcia so long as Michael Zerafa agreed to step aside, and he did, but it took them so long to make that fight that they reordered this one. The WBA did.
Because it was taking so long to schedule the Garcia fight. Now here we are.
Been over a year since Erislandy Lara's last fight, and if he takes care of business and stays champion, how long will it be before they get him another fight with another fighter? And what is that fight going to be worth, given who they have in their stable? I feel like he might make better money taking that WBA title over to Top Rank and seeing if he can't unify it with Yanni Bekalim Kanalai, who's got the other 2 belts at this weight. He said he wants to fight Lara.
Lara is a defending champion. Perhaps he can convince Bob to give him a decent-sized purse to unify with their boy.
How much is he really making to fight a guy like Michael Zerafa? How much longer does he want to keep doing this?